The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch as Maya stood on the wooden porch, her coffee growing cold in her hands. 3 years. 3 long years since she'd seen that beat-up blue pickup truck making its way down the gravel road toward her family's property. But there it was, kicking up a cloud of dust that seemed to hang in the still Montana air like a question mark. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the truck got closer. She knew that vehicle as well as she knew her own reflection. How many times had she ridden in that passenger seat, windows down, country music playing, laughing at something silly he'd said? How many times had she waited on this very porch for him to come pick her up for their evening rides through the valley? The truck stopped near the barn and Maya watched as a tall figure stepped out. Even from a distance, she could tell it was him. The way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the careful way he closed the truck door. It was all so familiar it made her chest ache. Jake looked different, though. Broader across the shoulders, his dark hair shorter than she remembered. When he turned toward the house, she could see new lines around his eyes, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. He wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, work boots covered in dust from whatever road had brought him back to Cedar Valley. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the yard. Maya felt like she was looking at a ghost or maybe a memory that had suddenly come to life. All the anger she'd carefully buried, all the hurt she'd worked so hard to heal came rushing back like a flood. She remembered the last time they'd stood in this same yard. The night before what should have been their engagement party. The night he'd told her he was leaving. Not in a week, not in a month, but right then. That very night. No explanation that made sense, no promise to call, no forwarding address. Just a mumbled apology and the sound of his truck disappearing into the darkness. Maya. His voice carried across the yard, deeper than she remembered but unmistakably his. She didn't respond, couldn't respond. Her throat felt like someone had filled it with sand. Jake started walking toward the porch, his steps slow and careful, like he was approaching a spooked horse. Which Maya thought bitterly wasn't far from the truth. She felt ready to bolt at any second. "You look good," he said when he reached the bottom of the porch steps. His green eyes met hers and she saw something there she couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe. Or fear. "What are you doing here, Jake?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was something at least. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a gesture she remembered from when they were teenagers and he was nervous about something. "My dad passed away 2 months ago. Heart attack." Maya felt a stab of something. Not quite sympathy, but not indifference either. Old Thomas had been gruff and difficult, but he'd been part of the community for 40 years. "I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you." Jake nodded. "I'm here to settle his affairs. The ranch, his debts, all of it. So he was here on business." Of course he was. Maya felt foolish for the tiny part of her that had wondered just for a second if maybe he'd come back for her. "How long are you staying?" she asked, proud of how casual she managed to make the question sound. "I'm not sure yet. Depends on how complicated everything is." He paused, looking around the property. "Your place looks good. Really good." It did look good, and Maya was proud of what she'd accomplished in the 3 years since he'd left. The barn had a fresh coat of red paint, the fences were all in good repair, and her veterinary practice was thriving. She'd built a good life here, a stable life without him. "I've been busy," she said simply. An awkward silence stretched between them. Maya could hear the wind moving through the cottonwood trees by the creek, the distant sound of cattle in the far pasture, the creak of the porch swing where they used to sit together in the evenings. Jake started, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, another old gesture that brought back a flood of memories she didn't want to deal with right now. "Don't," she said quickly. "Just don't." He nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. This wasn't the time or place for explanations or apologies. Maybe there would never be a right time for those things. "I should go," he said. "I just wanted you to know I was back. Didn't want you to hear it from someone else in town." "I appreciate that," Maya replied, though she wasn't sure she meant it. Jake turned to leave, then looked back over his shoulder. "For what it's worth, I never meant to hurt you." Before she could respond, he was walking back to his truck. Maya watched him go, noting the slight limp in his left leg that hadn't been there before. Another change, another piece of evidence that 3 years was a long time, long enough for people to become different versions of themselves. The truck started with a familiar rumble, and Jake backed out of the yard without looking at the house again. Maya stood on the porch until the dust settled, and the sound of the engine faded into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to sink into the porch swing, her legs suddenly too shaky to support her. Her coffee was stone cold now, but she took a sip anyway, needing something to do with her hands. 3 years ago, when Jake left, Maya thought her world had ended. She'd spent weeks crying, months angry, and nearly a year trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. Eventually, with the help of her family and friends, she'd picked up the pieces and built something new. Something that didn't depend on anyone else for its foundation. Now he was back, and she could already feel those carefully constructed walls starting to crack. Just seeing him had brought back feelings she thought she'd buried for good. The way her heart had sped up when she recognized his truck. The way her hands had trembled when he said her name. The way part of her had wanted to run down those porch steps and into his arms despite everything. But she wasn't the same person who'd loved him so completely 3 years ago. That Maya had been young and trusting, ready to build her entire future around one person. This Maya knew better. This Maya had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, to find happiness that didn't depend on anyone else's presence or absence. Still, as she sat on the porch swing and watched the sun climb higher in the sky, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change again. Jake was back, and whether she liked it or not, that meant their stories weren't finished yet. She just hoped that this time, whatever happened between them, she'd be strong enough to handle it. Because losing him once had nearly broken her. She wasn't sure she could survive it happening again. The old farmhouse felt smaller than Jake remembered as he walked through rooms that still smelled like his father's cigarettes and black coffee. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months, maybe years. Every surface was covered with papers, bills, and legal documents that painted a picture of a man who'd given up on life, long before his heart finally stopped beating. Jake picked up a stack of unpaid bills from the kitchen table, scanning the amounts with growing concern. Electric company, feed store, veterinary services, bank notices. His father had let everything slide in his final months, and now Jake was left to untangle the mess. The ranch itself was in even worse shape than the house. Fences sagged under the weight of neglect. The barn roof had several missing shingles, and the pastures were overgrown with weeds. Jake had spent the morning walking the property line, making mental notes of everything that needed attention. The list was longer than he'd hoped. What surprised him most was how quiet everything felt. Growing up here, the ranch had always been full of life, cattle lowing in the distance, his father shouting orders to the hired hands, the constant hum of activity that came with running a working ranch. Now it felt like a ghost town, empty and forgotten. Jake sat down heavily in his father's old recliner, the leather cracked and worn smooth from years of use. 3 years in the military had changed him in ways he was still figuring out. The boy who'd left Cedar Valley in a panic had been replaced by a man who'd seen parts of the world he'd never wanted to see. Done things he tried not to think about too often. 2 tours overseas had taught him about responsibility, about the weight of decisions and the cost of running away from problems. Every day for 3 years he'd thought about Maya and the choice he'd made. Every day he'd wondered if there might have been another way to handle things. A way that didn't involve breaking the heart of the only woman he'd ever loved. His phone buzzed with a text from his buddy Carlos, who was helping him sort through legal paperwork back in town. Lawyer wants to meet tomorrow at 2. Bring all the financial stuff you can find. Jake looked around at the chaos surrounding him and sighed. Finding financial documents in this mess was going to be like looking for a needle in a haystack. His father had never been organized on his best days, and toward the end, it looked like he'd given up trying altogether. As he started sorting through papers on the coffee table, Jake found himself thinking about his conversation with Maya that morning. She looked exactly the same, but completely different, if that made any sense. Same dark hair that caught the light just right. Same brown eyes that seemed to see straight through him. But there was a strength in her posture now, a confidence that hadn't been there when they were younger. The Maya he'd left behind had been sweet and trusting, ready to follow him anywhere and build whatever life he wanted them to have. This Maya looked like she'd built her own life just fine without him, thank you very much. Part of him was proud of her for that. Another part of him felt a loss so deep it took his breath away. He'd driven past her veterinary clinic on his way through town earlier that week, before he'd worked up the courage to actually go see her. The building was new, professional looking. with a sign that read Cedar Valley Animal Care, Dr. Maya Santos, DVM. He'd sat in his truck across the street for nearly an hour, watching people come and go with their pets, seeing Maya through the window as she worked. She'd achieved her dream of becoming a veterinarian, the goal she'd talked about constantly when they were together. Jake remembered late nights when she'd study for her pre-vet classes while he worked on ranch accounts. How excited she'd get when she talked about helping animals, making a difference in the community. Now she was doing exactly that, and he'd had nothing to do with her success. The realization was both humbling and heartbreaking. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Jake wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment he wondered if Maya had decided to come talk to him after all. But when he opened the door, he found Ben Martinez, Maya's older brother, standing on the porch with his arms crossed and an expression that could freeze hell over. Ben. Jake nodded, unsurprised by the visit but not particularly excited about it either. Jake. Ben's voice was flat, businesslike. We need to talk. Come on in. Jake stepped back, gesturing to the cluttered living room. Sorry about the mess. I'm still sorting through everything. Ben remained standing, clearly not planning to stay long. I'm not here to chat about your housekeeping. I'm here to talk about my sister. Jake had expected this conversation from the moment he'd decided to come back to Cedar Valley. Ben had always been protective of Maya, even when they were kids. After Jake left, Ben had probably been the one helping her pick up the pieces. I know you're probably not happy to see me back, Jake said carefully. Happy? Ben let out a short laugh that held no humor. Jake, you destroyed her. You want to know what she was like after you left? She didn't eat for 2 weeks. Didn't sleep. Mom thought she was going to end up in the hospital. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He'd known leaving would hurt Maya, but he'd convinced himself it would be better in the long run. Hearing about the immediate aftermath made him question everything all over again. It took her almost 2 years to start dating again, Ben continued. 2 years before she could even look at another guy without comparing him to you. And you know what? She never found anyone who measured up because she was still in love with a ghost. Ben, I'm not finished. Ben's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it. She built herself back up from nothing. Became stronger than she ever was before. Found her own way, made her own success. And now you're back, and I can already see what it's doing to her. Jake wanted to defend himself, to explain the impossible situation he'd been in 3 years ago, but he knew Ben wouldn't want to hear it. And maybe Ben was right to be angry. Maybe there had been other options Jake had been too young and scared to see. I don't want to hurt her again, Jake said quietly. Then leave, Ben replied without hesitation. Sell your dad's place to someone else and go back to wherever you've been for the past 3 years. Let her keep the life she's built. It's not that simple, it's exactly that simple. Ben stepped closer, and Jake could see the family resemblance to Maya in the set of his jaw, the determination in his eyes. She's happy now, Jake, really happy. Don't take that away from her because you're feeling guilty or nostalgic or whatever this is. After Ben left, Jake sat back down in his father's chair and stared at the wall. Maybe Ben was right. Maybe the kindest thing he could do was handle his business as quickly as possible and leave town again. Find a way to sell the ranch without having much contact with Maya. Disappear back into whatever life he'd built for himself somewhere else. But as he looked around at the property that had been in his family for 3 generations, as he thought about the community he'd grown up in, and the roots that ran deeper than he'd ever admitted to himself, Jake realized it wasn't that simple at all. He was tired of running, tired of living like a man without a home, moving from place to place without ever really belonging anywhere. The military had given him structure and purpose, but it hadn't given him peace. Cedar Valley was where he belonged, for better or worse. And Maya was part of this place, woven into every memory he had of home. Whether they could find a way to coexist or not remained to be seen. But he wasn't going to make any decisions based on fear this time. He'd spent 3 years learning to be a better man. Now it was time to find out if that man was good enough to earn a second chance. The drought had been building for weeks, but Maya didn't realize how serious things were getting until she found herself standing in what used to be Cedar Creek, staring at cracked mud where flowing water should have been. The creek that ran between her property and the old Patterson ranch. Now, Jake's property had been reduced to scattered puddles that wouldn't last another week in this heat. She kicked at a dried-up piece of creek bed, sending up a small cloud of dust. This was bad. Really bad. Without the creek, both ranches would struggle to keep their cattle watered, and moving the herds to other pastures wasn't a simple solution when everyone else in the county was dealing with the same problem. Looks pretty grim, doesn't it? Maya spun around, her heart jumping at the unexpected voice. Jake stood about 20 feet away, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking as worried as she felt. She hadn't heard him approach, which irritated her. She used to be better at sensing when he was around. It's not great, she admitted, trying to keep her voice neutral. They hadn't spoken since that awkward encounter on her porch 2 weeks ago, though she'd seen his truck around town and heard through the local grapevine that he was working hard to get his father's property back in shape. Jake walked closer, stopping at the edge of what used to be the deepest part of the creek. I was talking to old Pete at the feed store yesterday. He says this is the worst drought they've had in 15 years. That's what I heard too. Maya watched him carefully, wondering what he was getting at. In the past 2 weeks, she'd done her best to avoid thinking about him, but seeing him again brought back that same unsettled feeling she'd had the day he returned. My dad's old well is still working, Jake said, not looking at her directly. It's not producing as much as it used to, but there's enough water for both our herds if we're smart about it. Maya blinked, surprised by the offer. You want to share water rights? I want to keep our cattle alive, Jake replied simply. Seems like the practical thing to do, given the circumstances. She couldn't argue with that logic, even though every instinct she had was telling her to find another solution. Any solution that didn't involve working closely with Jake Thompson for the foreseeable future. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. Jake finally met her eyes, and she could see he'd been thinking about this carefully. We combine the herds temporarily, move them to the pasture closest to the well. Split the work, split the costs, keep everyone fed and watered until this dry spell breaks. It made sense. It made perfect sense, which was the most frustrating part. Maya had been losing sleep for a week, trying to figure out how to handle the water situation. And here Jake was offering the most logical solution on a silver platter. I'll need to see the well set up first, she said finally. And we'd need to work out a fair arrangement for feed costs and labor. Of course. Jake's shoulders relaxed slightly, like he'd been expecting her to turn him down flat. You want to come take a look now? The responsible part of Maya's brain said yes immediately. The part that remembered how much it had hurt when he left wanted to find any excuse to say no. In the end, responsibility won out. Her cattle were depending on her to make smart decisions, regardless of her personal feelings. Lead the way, she said. The walk to Jake's property took about 15 minutes. Following what was left of the creek bed through a grove of cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade from the afternoon sun. Maya had walked this path countless times when they were younger, usually racing to meet Jake somewhere in the middle for one of their evening adventures. Now they walked in careful silence, keeping a respectable distance between them. Maya found herself studying Jake when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing changes she hadn't caught during their brief encounter at her house. He moved differently now, more deliberately, like someone who'd learned to be constantly aware of his surroundings. There was a scar on his left hand that hadn't been there before, and she caught herself wondering how he'd gotten it. Here we are, Jake said, pointing to a cluster of equipment near the old barn. Dad had it updated about 5 years ago, but the pump mechanism is solid. Maya examined the well setup with a critical eye, testing the water flow and checking the electrical connections. Jake knew enough to stay quiet while she worked, which surprised her. The old Jake would have been talking the entire time, trying to fill any silence with conversation. This could work, she admitted after about 20 minutes of inspection. The output is good and the water quality looks clean. So we have a deal? Maya hesitated, knowing that once she agreed to this arrangement, she'd be seeing Jake on a daily basis for weeks, maybe months. They'd be working together, making decisions together, spending time in each other's company whether she wanted to or not. But looking around at the brown, drought-stressed grass and thinking about her cattle standing in whatever shade they could find, panting in the heat, the choice was obvious. We have a deal, she said. Over the next few days, they worked out the logistics of combining their herds. Jake proved he'd learned a lot during his time away, handling the cattle with quiet confidence and showing a level of organization that impressed Maya despite herself. He'd mapped out grazing rotations to prevent overuse of any single pasture area, calculated feed requirements down to the pound, and even researched the most efficient watering schedules to minimize stress on the well system. You've gotten good at this, Maya commented on their third day of working together, watching Jake expertly guide a group of stubborn steers toward the water trough. Had some good teachers in the army, he replied, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Logistics and resource management were big parts of my job. It was the first real piece of information he'd shared about his time away, and Maya found herself curious about what else he'd learned, what else had changed about him. But she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the work at hand. The routine they developed was efficient but careful. They'd meet at sunrise to check on the cattle and plan the day's work, spend the morning moving animals or repairing fences or handling whatever needed attention, then part ways for lunch and individual errands before meeting again in the evening to make sure everyone was settled for the night. It was professional, practical, and absolutely exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with the physical work. Maya found herself hyper-aware of Jake's every movement, every word, every glance. She caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, remembering things about him she'd tried to forget, noticing new things that made her wonder what else about him had changed. The worst part was how easy it was to fall back into old patterns. Jake anticipated her movements around the cattle like he'd never been away. He handed her tools before she asked for them, remembered exactly how she liked things organized, picked up conversations mid-sentence like they'd been talking just yesterday instead of 3 years ago. "This isn't going to work," she muttered to herself one evening as she drove home. Exhausted and confused and more unsettled than she'd felt since the day he'd returned. But even as she said it, Maya knew she was lying to herself. It was working. It was working better than either of them had any right to expect, and that scared her more than anything else. The call came in at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, just as Maya was finally settling into bed with a book she'd been trying to read for 2 weeks. Her phone buzzed with Jake's number, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail. "Nothing good ever came from late-night phone calls, Maya." Jake's voice was tight with worry. "I'm sorry to call so late, but I've got a mare in trouble. She's been trying to foal for hours and something's not right." Maya was already reaching for her clothes before he finished talking. "Which barn?" "The old one on the north side of the property. I've got her in the big stall with the overhead light. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The drive to Jake's ranch felt longer than usual in the darkness, her emergency kit bouncing around in the passenger seat as she navigated the rough gravel road. When she pulled up to the barn, she could see light spilling from the open doors and hear the distressed sounds of an animal in pain. Jake met her at the barn entrance, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. "She's been pushing for 3 hours, but nothing's happening. I think the foal might be positioned wrong." Maya followed him to the stall where a beautiful chestnut mare was lying on her side, breathing heavily between contractions. One look told Maya everything she needed to know about the situation. "You're right about the positioning," she said, already pulling on latex gloves. "This is going to be tricky." For the next 2 hours, Maya worked carefully to reposition the foal, while Jake held the mare's head, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. It was delicate work that required complete focus and steady hands, made more challenging by the mare's exhaustion and stress. "Come on, girl," Maya murmured, sweat dripping down her face as she worked. "Just a little more cooperation here." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she felt the foal shift into the correct position. "Okay, here we go. This next contraction should do it." Sure enough, the foal slipped free in a rush of fluid, landing in the straw with a wet thud. For a terrifying moment, it lay completely still, and Maya's heart stopped. Then the little colt shook his head and took his first shaky breath. "He's beautiful," Jake said softly, his voice full of wonder as the mare began cleaning her baby. Maya sat back on her heels, exhausted but relieved. "He's going to be just fine." "They both are." They watched in comfortable silence as the foal struggled to his feet on wobbly legs, instinctively searching for his first meal. The mare, despite her ordeal, was already nuzzling him encouragingly. "I can't thank you enough," Jake said as they finally stepped out of the stall, giving the new family some privacy. "I was starting to panic." "That's what neighbors do," Maya replied automatically, then immediately regretted the casual way she'd said it. Were they neighbors now, friends? Something else entirely? Jake seemed to catch the awkwardness too because he looked away quickly. "I'll put some coffee on. Looks like we're both going to be here for a while anyway, making sure everything stays stable." The ranch house kitchen was cleaner than it had been the last time Maya had seen it, she noticed. Jake had obviously been working hard to make the place livable again. The coffee was strong and hot, and Maya wrapped her hands around the mug gratefully. "I should probably stay another hour or two," she said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table, "just to make sure there are no complications." "I appreciate it." Jake sat down across from her, and in the soft light of the kitchen lamp, Maya could see exhaustion written across his features. "I've been worried about her for days. She's been acting restless, and I wasn't sure if it was normal or if something was wrong." "First-time mothers can be unpredictable," Maya said. "You did the right thing calling me." They sat quietly for a while, listening to the night sounds outside and the occasional soft nickering from the barn. Maya found herself studying Jake's hands wrapped around his coffee mug, noting the calluses that spoke of hard physical work and the thin white scar across his knuckles that definitely hadn't been there before. "Where did you go?" she heard herself ask, then immediately wished she could take the question back. Jake looked up, surprised. "After you left, I mean," Maya continued, feeling like she might as well finish what she'd started. "I always wondered." "Army," Jake said simply. "Enlisted right after I left here. Did 2 tours overseas." That explained the scar, the way he moved, the new seriousness in his eyes. "That must have been hard." "It was." Jake's voice was quiet, careful, but it taught me a lot about myself, about responsibility, about the consequences of running away from problems instead of facing them. The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Maya took another sip of coffee, buying herself time to think. "Jake," she started, then stopped. She'd rehearsed this conversation in her head 1,000 times over the past few weeks. But now that the moment was here, she couldn't find the words. "You want to know why I left," he said, reading her expression. "I think I deserve to know," Maya replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Jake was quiet for so long that Maya started to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My dad was gambling. Had been for years, apparently. I didn't find out until a few days before our engagement party." Jake stared down at his coffee, unable to meet her eyes. "He'd lost everything, Maya. The ranch, all of it. And he'd used your family's property as collateral for some of his debts." Maya felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "What?" "He told me that if I didn't disappear, if we went through with the engagement, the creditors would come after your ranch too. Your family would lose everything because of my father's mistakes." Jake's hands were shaking slightly as he set down his mug. "I was 22 years old and I panicked. I thought if I left, if I broke up with you and got out of town, maybe the debt would die with me." "You left to protect my family?" Maya's voice came out strangled. "I left because I was a coward," Jake said firmly. "I should have told you the truth. Should have found another way to handle it, but I was young and scared and I thought I was being noble." He finally looked up at her, his green eyes full of pain. "Instead, I just hurt everyone I cared about and solved nothing." Maya stared at him, her mind reeling. All these years, she'd thought Jake had left because he didn't love her enough, because their relationship wasn't important enough to him, because she wasn't enough. To find out that he'd left because he loved her, because he was trying to protect her family, turned everything she thought she knew upside down. "What happened to the debt?" she managed to ask. "Dad declared bankruptcy 6 months later anyway. Lost the ranch to the bank, though they let him stay on as a tenant for a reduced rent. Turns out running away didn't solve anything, just like most running away doesn't. And you found all this out later?" "Some of it. The rest I pieced together from his papers after he died." Jake rubbed his face tiredly. "Maya, I know it doesn't change anything. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix 3 years of hurt. But I need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted it." Maya sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything he'd told her. 3 years of anger, 3 years of wondering what she'd done wrong, 3 years of thinking she hadn't been enough for him, and all along he'd been trying to save her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Jake replied. "I just needed you to know the truth." Outside, they could hear the new foal moving around in the straw, finding his legs and exploring his small world. Inside, Maya felt like her own world had just shifted on its axis, and she wasn't sure which way was up anymore. Maya spent the next 3 days avoiding Jake completely, which was harder than it should have been considering they were supposed to be managing cattle together. She found excuses to check on the herd at different times than usual. sent text messages instead of talking face to face, and generally did everything she could to avoid processing what he'd told her that night in his kitchen. But avoiding Jake didn't stop her mind from racing. She'd wake up at 4 in the morning thinking about everything he'd said, replaying the conversation over and over, trying to reconcile this new information with the story she'd been telling herself for 3 years. All this time, she'd been angry at him for being selfish, for putting his own wants ahead of their relationship. Now she was angry at him for being selfless in the most destructive way possible. How dare he make a decision that huge without talking to her first? How dare he decide what was best for her family without giving them a chance to fight for themselves? And underneath the anger was something even more complicated. Grief. Grief for the 3 years they'd lost. Grief for the pain they'd both carried unnecessarily. Grief for the young couple who'd been so in love they couldn't imagine anything ever coming between them. On Thursday morning, Maya was checking fence posts in the far pasture when she saw smoke rising from the direction of town. At first she thought maybe someone was burning brush, but the smoke was too thick, too dark. Then the wind shifted, and she caught the acrid smell that made her stomach drop. Wildfire. She was already running toward her truck when her phone started ringing with the emergency alert system. By the time she reached the main road, she could see other vehicles racing toward town, and the smoke had grown into a massive black cloud on the horizon. The fire had started somewhere near the old Miller place, about 5 miles east of town, and with the dry conditions and steady wind, it was moving fast. Maya drove straight to the community center, which served as the emergency coordination point for situations like this. The parking lot was already full of trucks and trailers as people prepared to help with evacuations and livestock rescue. "Maya!" Sheriff Rodriguez waved her over as soon as she got out of her truck. "We need you in your trailer for animal evacuations. The fire's moving toward the Henderson Ranch and they've got about 200 head of cattle that need to be moved." "Of course," Maya replied, already calculating logistics in her head. "Where are we moving them to?" "Fairgrounds for now until we can figure out something more permanent. Jake Thompson's already headed out there with his trailer. You two can coordinate on the cattle, and we'll send some other folks to help with the horses and smaller animals." Maya's stomach clenched at the mention of Jake's name. But this wasn't the time to worry about personal drama. Animals were in danger, and that took priority over everything else. The drive to the Henderson Ranch was like driving into a nightmare. The sky had turned an ominous orange-brown color, and ash was falling like snow on her windshield. She could see flames in the distance moving through the dry grass faster than she'd thought possible. Jake was already there when she arrived, working with old Fred Henderson to sort cattle into groups for transport. He looked up when she pulled in, relief clear on his face. "Thank God," he called over the noise of stressed cattle and shouting volunteers. "We need to move fast. The fire's maybe 2 miles out and heading this way." For the next 4 hours, Maya forgot about everything except the job at hand. She and Jake worked together like they had all those years ago, anticipating each other's movements, communicating with quick glances and hand signals when the noise made talking impossible. Load after load of cattle were transported to safety, along with horses, goats, and a collection of barn cats that Fred's wife refused to leave behind. "That's the last of them," Jake said as they loaded the final group of cattle into Maya's trailer. The fire was close enough now that they could feel the heat on their faces and hear the crackling of burning grass. "Let's get out of here." They convoyed back toward town, Maya following Jake's truck through air thick with smoke. Halfway there, she saw him pull over suddenly and jump out of his cab. His trailer tire had blown, and without a spare, he was stuck. Maya pulled up behind him and was out of her truck before she'd even turned off the engine. "We can transfer them to my trailer," she said, already opening the back of Jake's trailer. "It'll be crowded, but it's better than leaving them here." "Are you sure? That's a lot of weight for your truck." "We'll make it work." They managed to squeeze all the cattle into Maya's trailer, though it meant a slow, careful drive back to the fairgrounds. By the time they arrived, Maya's truck was overheating, and her trailer was groaning under the weight. But they'd made it. "I owe you," Jake said as they unloaded the last of the cattle into the temporary pens. He was covered in soot and sweat, his shirt torn from wrestling with panicked animals. But Maya thought he'd never looked more like the man she'd fallen in love with years ago. "We're even," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what they were even for. The evacuation efforts continued through the night. Maya and Jake found themselves working side by side again and again, rescuing animals from ranch after ranch as the fire continued its destructive path through the valley. They didn't talk about personal things, didn't mention the conversation from earlier that week, but there was something different between them now. A understanding maybe, or at least the beginning of one. It wasn't until almost dawn that the fire crews finally got the blaze under control. Maya found herself sitting on the tailgate of her truck in the fairgrounds parking lot, exhausted and filthy and emotionally drained. Jake appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee from the emergency services station. "Rough night," he said, settling onto the tailgate next to her. "Yeah." Maya accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, but it could have been a lot worse. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over a landscape that looked different than it had the day before. The fire had burned thousands of acres, destroyed 2 barns and several outbuildings, but amazingly, no lives had been lost, human or animal. "Jake," Maya said finally, her voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion, "about what you told me the other night." "Maya, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She turned to look at him, noting the way the early morning light highlighted the worry lines around his eyes. "I've been thinking about it, and I'm angry." Jake's shoulders sagged. "I know. I understand." "No, you don't understand." Maya's voice was stronger now, fueled by 3 days of thinking and 1 night of working together. "I'm not angry that you wanted to protect my family. I'm angry that you didn't trust me enough to let me help. I'm angry that you made a decision about my life without including me in it." Jake started to respond, but Maya held up a hand to stop him. "I'm angry that you thought the solution was to break both our hearts instead of fighting for what we had. I'm angry that you didn't give us a chance to figure it out together." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But mostly I'm angry that we lost 3 years because you were too scared to trust me with the truth." "I was trying to protect you," Jake said quietly. "I know you were, and I understand why you thought that was the right thing to do. But Jake, we were supposed to be partners. We were supposed to face problems together, not make huge sacrificial gestures behind each other's backs." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the smoke-hazed valley. "You're right," he said finally. "I should have trusted you. Should have trusted us." "Yes, you should have." Maya's voice was gentler now, but still firm. "If we're going to have any kind of relationship moving forward, even just as neighbors, you need to understand that I'm not some delicate flower who needs to be protected from difficult truths. I'm a grown woman who can handle whatever life throws at me." "I can see that," Jake said, and there was something like admiration in his voice. "You've become incredible, Maya. Stronger than I ever imagined you could be." "I had to become strong," she replied. "I didn't have much choice after you left." They finished their coffee as the sun climbed higher, painting the smoky sky in shades of pink and gold. Around them, the fairgrounds were coming to life as people arrived to check on evacuated animals and assess the damage from the night before. "So where does that leave us?" Jake asked finally. Maya considered the question, thinking about everything that had happened between them in the past few weeks. The awkwardness, the anger, the way they'd worked together so seamlessly during the emergency, the truth he'd finally told her, and the complicated feelings that truth had stirred up. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think we can start with being honest with each other. No more secrets, no more grand gestures, no more making decisions for each other without talking first." "I can do that," Jake said. "Good," Maya replied, "because if you ever try to protect me by breaking my heart again, I'll never forgive you." "Understood." Maya looked at him. This man who'd been such a huge part of her past and was now, somehow, becoming part of her present again. She wasn't ready to forgive him completely, wasn't ready to trust him with her heart again, but maybe they could find a way to be in each other's lives without destroying each other. "Friends?" she asked, extending her hand. 3 weeks after the fire, Maya and Jake had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. They met each morning to check on their combined cattle herd, worked together to repair fire damage on both properties, and had developed an easy friendship that surprised them both. Maya had begun to think that maybe they really could just be friends, that the romantic part of their relationship was truly in the past. Then Jake nearly died saving her life, and everything changed again. It started as a routine day. They were moving a group of cattle from the burned pasture to an area with better grass, when Maya noticed that one of her prize heifers had wandered into a section of the barn that had been damaged in the fire. The roof was unstable, held up by beams that the fire department had marked as dangerous. But the heifer was trapped behind fallen debris and couldn't get out on her own. "I can get her," Maya said, studying the situation. "If I go in from the side entrance and move that board, she should be able to find her way out." "Maya, no." Jake grabbed her arm as she started toward the barn. "Look at those support beams. That whole section could come down. She's worth $15,000. Jake, I can't just leave her in there. It's not worth your life." But Maya was already pulling free from his grip, her mind made up. The heifer was scared and getting more agitated by the minute. If she panicked and started thrashing around, she could hurt herself badly, or bring the roof down anyway. Maya slipped through the side entrance carefully, talking softly to calm the frightened animal. The air inside the barn was thick with dust and the lingering smell of smoke. Above her head, she could hear the damaged beams creaking ominously. "Easy, girl," she murmured, working to move the fallen board that was blocking the heifer's path to safety. "Just stay calm and we'll get you out of here." The board was heavier than it looked, and Maya had to brace herself against a support post to get enough leverage to move it. That's when she heard the sharp crack from somewhere above her head. She looked up just in time to see a massive beam breaking loose from its supports, falling directly toward her. There was no time to run, no time to think, only time to throw herself sideways and hope it missed her. It didn't miss. The beam caught her across the shoulder and chest, driving her to the ground and pinning her under its weight. Pain exploded through her body, and for a moment her vision went dark around the edges. "Maya!" Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away, but she could hear the panic in it. "I'm okay." She tried to call back, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The beam was heavy enough that she could barely breathe, let alone speak loudly. She heard running footsteps. Then Jake was beside her, his face white with fear. "Maya, can you hear me? How bad is it?" "Can't breathe," she managed to gasp. Jake looked at the beam that had her pinned, calculating angles and weight distribution, with the same quick assessment skills he'd learned in the military. "I'm going to lift this, and when I do, you need to roll toward me. Can you do that?" Maya nodded, not trusting her voice. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. Jake threw his whole body weight into lifting the beam, his face turning red with effort. Maya rolled as instructed, gasping as the pressure came off her chest. But as she cleared the danger zone, she heard another ominous crack from above. This time it was a much larger section of roof giving way, and Jake was still bent over, off balance from lifting the beam. He looked up at the falling debris, and Maya could see in his eyes that he knew he wasn't going to be able to get clear in time. Without thinking, Maya lunged forward, tackling Jake around the waist and driving them both toward the barn entrance as chunks of roof and burning timber crashed down behind them. They hit the ground hard just outside the barn, Maya on top of Jake, both of them breathing heavily. For a moment, they just lay there in the dirt, too shocked to move. Then Jake's arms came up around her, holding her tightly against his chest. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I'm okay," Maya replied, taking inventory of her various aches and pains. Her shoulder was going to be bruised for weeks, and she'd scraped her hands and knees in the fall. But nothing seemed to be seriously damaged. "Maya." Jake's voice was different now, soft and uncertain. "Maya, look at me." She lifted her head to meet his eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. It was the same look he'd given her years ago, when they were young and in love and thought nothing could ever come between them. "I thought I was going to lose you," he whispered. "You saved my life," she whispered back. "You saved mine too." They were still tangled together in the dirt, faces inches apart, and Maya could feel the rapid beat of Jake's heart against her chest. All the careful boundaries they'd established over the past few weeks, all the promises to be just friends, seemed to evaporate in the space between one breath and the next. "Maya," Jake said again, and this time her name sounded like a prayer. She should have pulled away, should have reminded them both that they were supposed to be taking things slow, building trust, figuring out how to be in each other's lives without destroying each other again. Instead, she leaned down and kissed him. It was supposed to be a quick kiss, a moment of relief and gratitude after a close call. But the second their lips met, 3 years of separation and longing and carefully buried feelings came rushing to the surface. Jake's hand came up to tangle in her hair, and Maya melted against him like she was coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, Both of them were breathing hard and staring at each other with something like wonder. That was... Jake started. A mistake, Maya finished. But she didn't sound like she meant it, was it? Maya sat up slowly, suddenly aware that they were having this conversation in full view of anyone who might drive by. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. Jake sat up too, reaching over to gently brush dirt from her cheek. Maya, I know we said we'd be friends. I know we agreed to take things slow, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day in 3 years. Jake, I know it's complicated. I know I hurt you and that trust doesn't come back overnight. But what just happened in there, when I thought I might lose you again, I can't pretend anymore that friendship is enough for me. Maya looked at him. This man she'd loved so completely when she was young, who'd broken her heart so thoroughly. She'd thought she'd never recover. 3 weeks ago, she would have said it was impossible for them to find their way back to each other. But 3 weeks ago, she hadn't watched him risk his life to save hers. She hadn't felt the way he held her afterward, like she was the most precious thing in the world. I'm scared, she admitted. Me too, Jake replied honestly. I'm terrified I'll mess this up again. But Maya, I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if we didn't try. A truck was approaching on the road, probably someone coming to check on them after seeing the barn collapse. Maya stood up, brushing dirt from her clothes and trying to compose herself. We should talk about this, she said. Really talk. About what we want, what we're afraid of, how we make sure we don't hurt each other again. Whenever you're ready, Jake said, getting to his feet as well. I'm not going anywhere this time. As the truck pulled into the yard and concerned neighbors climbed out to check on them, Maya found herself believing him. More than that, she found herself hoping that maybe, just maybe, they really could find their way back to each other. But this time, they would do it right. This time they would do it together. The conversation Maya had been both dreading and anticipating finally happened 3 days after the barn collapse, on a quiet evening when they finished checking the cattle earlier than usual. Jake had been patient, giving her space to process what had happened between them, but Maya could see the questions in his eyes every time they worked together. Want to sit for a while? She asked, gesturing toward the porch swing on her back deck. It seemed like a safe, neutral place to have a conversation that might change everything between them again. Sure, Jake replied, settling onto the swing beside her but careful to leave space between them. For a few minutes they just swayed gently back and forth, watching the sun set over the valley and listening to the evening sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Maya had rehearsed this conversation in her head dozens of times, but now that the moment was here, she wasn't sure where to start. I've been thinking about what you said, she began finally, about not being able to pretend friendship is enough. Jake tensed slightly beside her. And I think you're right. I think I've been pretending too. Maya took a deep breath, gathering her courage. But Jake, I need you to understand how scared I am. When you left 3 years ago, it nearly destroyed me. I spent months feeling like I wasn't enough, like I'd somehow failed to be worth staying for. Maya, that was never. I know that now, she interrupted gently, but it took me a long time to believe it, and even longer to build myself back up into someone who felt whole again. Jake was quiet, waiting for her to continue. I love who I've become, Maya said. I love my independence, my career, the life I've built here. And I'm terrified that if I let myself love you again, I'll somehow lose that I'll go back to being the girl who was ready to shape her entire future around someone else's dreams. I would never ask you to do that, Jake said softly. The woman you've become, Maya, you're incredible. You're stronger and more confident and more sure of yourself than I ever imagined you could be. I don't want to change that. I want to be part of it. But how do we do that? How do we build something together without losing ourselves in the process? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering her question seriously. I think we start by being honest about what we want, not just from each other, but from our own lives, and then we figure out how to support each other's goals instead of asking each other to sacrifice them. What do you want? Maya asked. I want to stay here, Jake said without hesitation. I want to make the ranch work, to be part of this community again. I want to wake up every morning knowing I'm home. He paused, then continued more quietly. And I want to wake up next to you. I want to build a life with you, but not at the expense of the life you've already built for yourself. Maya felt her heart flutter at his words, but she pushed past the emotion to focus on the practical concerns. What about your goals? What do you want to do with your life beyond just being here? I've been thinking about that a lot lately, Jake replied. I want to expand the ranch operation, maybe get into breeding quality horses. I've got some ideas about sustainable ranching practices I learned about during my time away, and I'd like to start a program to help other veterans transition back to civilian life. Use the ranch as a place where people can come to heal and find their footing again. Maya turned to look at him, surprised and impressed by the thoughtfulness of his plans. That sounds amazing. And it sounds like something you could do whether we're together or not. Exactly. I'm not trying to build a life that only works if you're in it. I'm trying to build a life that would be complete on its own, but would be better with you as part of it. They swayed in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Maya found herself imagining what a relationship with this new, more mature version of Jake might look like. How they could support each other's dreams instead of asking each other to abandon them. I want to try, she said finally, but I need us to take it slow. I need to know that we can communicate better than we did before, that we can handle problems together instead of making big decisions in isolation. I want that too, Jake agreed. Maybe we should talk to someone. A counselor or therapist who can help us learn how to do this right? Maya blinked in surprise. The Jake she'd known years ago would never have suggested counseling. You'd be willing to do that? Maya, I'll do whatever it takes to make this work. I've learned a lot about getting help when you need it. There's no shame in admitting you don't have all the answers. Over the following weeks, they began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honest communication and mutual respect. They found a counselor in the county seat who specialized in helping couples work through trust issues, and they drove there together every Thursday afternoon for sessions that were sometimes difficult but always productive. Maya learned that Jake's time in the military had taught him not just about responsibility and leadership, but about the importance of seeking help when you're struggling. He'd dealt with his own trauma and guilt, with the help of counselors and support groups, and he'd learned that strength came not from handling everything alone, but from building a network of people you could rely on. Jake learned that Maya's independence wasn't a wall she'd built to keep him out, but a foundation she'd built to keep herself strong. She didn't want to be rescued or protected. She wanted to be partnered with. She wanted someone who would stand beside her as an equal, not someone who would try to shield her from life's difficulties. They took things slowly, deliberately, date nights that felt like getting to know each other all over again, long conversations about their fears, their dreams, their individual goals, and how they might fit together. Careful physical intimacy that rebuilt trust along with desire. The community watched their reunion with a mixture of curiosity and cautious approval. Some people, like Maya's brother Ben, remained skeptical about Jake's return and his intentions. Others, like old Pete at the feed store, seemed delighted to see them working together again. You two always were good for each other, Pete commented one afternoon when he saw them loading feed into Jake's truck. Just took the long way around to figure it out. Maya found herself thinking about that comment as she and Jake worked together to rebuild the damaged barn. They were good for each other, in ways that were both familiar and completely new. Jake's steady presence and practical problem-solving skills complemented her veterinary expertise and deep community connections. His military experience with logistics and planning paired well with her local knowledge and established relationships. But more than that, they'd both grown into people who were capable of being in a healthy relationship. Jake had learned to communicate directly instead of making assumptions about what was best for others. Maya had learned to trust her own strength and set boundaries that protected her independence while still allowing for intimacy. 6 months after the barn incident, they made their first major decision together, combining their ranch operations officially, pooling their resources and expertise to create something bigger and more sustainable than either could manage alone. Are you sure about this? Maya asked as they signed the paperwork in the lawyer's office. This is a big step. I'm sure, Jake replied, taking her hand across the conference table. We're better together, Maya, in business and in life. As they walked out of the lawyer's office hand in hand, Maya felt a sense of completeness she hadn't experienced in years. Not because Jake completed her, she'd learned that she was already whole on her own, but because they'd found a way to build something Together, that honored both of their individual strengths and dreams. It wasn't the same love they'd shared when they were young. It was deeper, more mature, built on a foundation of respect and understanding rather than just passion and hope. It was the kind of love that could weather difficulties because it was based on seeing each other clearly, flaws and all, and choosing to build a life together anyway. That evening, as they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset over their combined property, Maya realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as equals, as partners in every sense of the word. 1 year later, the annual Cedar Valley County Fair looked exactly the same as it had when Maya and Jake were teenagers sneaking away from their parents to ride the Ferris wheel together. The same colorful booths lined the midway, the same carnival music played from scratchy speakers, and the same smell of funnel cake and cotton candy filled the warm evening air. But everything else had changed. Maya walked through the fairgrounds with Jake's hand warm in hers, marveling at how different she felt from the nervous 18-year-old who'd won the blue ribbon for her horse's performance in the Western Pleasure Competition all those years ago. That girl had been so sure about her future, so confident that love was simple and life would unfold exactly as planned. This Maya knew better. This Maya understood that love was complicated and required work, that life rarely went according to plan, and that sometimes the best things came from the most unexpected directions. "Remember our first date here?" Jake asked as they paused near the Ferris wheel, watching couples and families enjoying the ride under the twinkling lights. "You were so nervous you spilled mustard on your shirt before we even got to the games." Maya laughed. "And then you won me that giant stuffed elephant that was too big to carry around for the rest of the night." "I still have that elephant somewhere." Jake grinned. "Your mom rescued it from your room when you moved out and gave it back to me when I came to ask permission to propose." Maya stopped walking, her heart skipping a beat. "What?" Jake's grin widened as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made Maya's breath catch. "I said, I went to ask your parents' permission to propose. Your dad gave me the 3rd degree for about an hour, but your mom just cried and said it was about time." "Jake?" Maya started, but he was already dropping to one knee right there in the middle of the fairgrounds, seemingly oblivious to the growing crowd of onlookers. "Maya Santos," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but beautiful diamond ring. "I asked you to marry me once before when we were young and thought love was easy. I'm asking you again now, when we're older and know that love is hard work but worth every effort." Maya felt tears starting to blur her vision as Jake continued. "I'm asking you to marry me not because I can't live without you, but because I don't want to. I'm asking you to build a life with me where we support each other's dreams, where we face problems together, where we choose each other every day even when it's difficult." The crowd around them had grown larger, and Maya could see familiar faces from the community watching with interest and approval. Mrs. Henderson from the post office was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Old Pete from the feed store was grinning from ear to ear. Even Ben, who'd maintained his skepticism about Jake's return longer than anyone else, was watching with what looked like genuine happiness. "Maya," Jake said softly, drawing her attention back to him, "will you marry me? For real this time? With no secrets between us and no running away when things get complicated?" Maya looked down at this man who'd broken her heart and then spent months earning back her trust, who'd learned to communicate honestly and fight fairly, who'd become not just the love of her life but her true partner in every sense of the word. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes." The crowd erupted in cheers as Jake slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her. Maya threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight as she whispered against his ear, "Don't leave me again." "Never again," Jake whispered back, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm home for good this time." The wedding took place 3 months later on a perfect October day when the leaves were turning gold and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. They held the ceremony on the combined ranch property, under a simple arch decorated with wildflowers and surrounded by friends and family from the entire community. Maya's dress was elegant but practical, suitable for walking across pasture land in heels that she kicked off halfway through the reception to dance barefoot in the grass. Jake wore his best suit with cowboy boots, looking handsome and nervous and completely smitten as he watched his bride walk down the makeshift aisle. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt. They'd written their own vows, promising not just to love each other but to support each other's individual growth, to communicate honestly even when it was difficult, and to face whatever challenges life brought them as a team. "I promise to trust you with my fears as well as my dreams," Maya said, looking directly into Jake's eyes as she spoke. "I promise to be your partner, not your responsibility, and to build a life with you that honors both of our strengths." "I promise to choose us every day," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I promise to be honest with you about everything, even when I'm scared or uncertain. And I promise that home will always be wherever you are." When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was sweet and sure, full of joy and relief and the quiet confidence that comes from choosing each other with full knowledge of both the challenges and rewards that lay ahead. The reception was a true community celebration. Everyone brought food to share. The local band played a mix of country classics and modern hits, and children ran around the property playing games while the adults talked and laughed and danced under the stars. Ben, who had spent the better part of 2 years being suspicious of Jake's return and protective of his sister's heart, gave a speech that surprised everyone, including Maya. "I'll be honest," he said, raising his glass to the newlyweds. "When Jake came back to town, I wanted him to leave. I thought he'd just hurt Maya again, and I couldn't stand the thought of watching her go through that pain a second time." Maya reached over to squeeze Jake's hand, feeling him tense slightly at Ben's words. "But watching them over the past year," Ben continued, "I've seen something I didn't expect. I've seen 2 people who learned from their mistakes, who grew up and figured out how to love each other better. Maya, you've always been strong, but you've never been happier than you are with Jake. And Jake, you've proven that people can change, that coming home sometimes means becoming the person you were meant to be all along." He raised his glass higher, to Maya and Jake, who took the long way around but found their way home to each other. The crowd echoed the toast, and Maya felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she looked around at all the people who'd supported them through their journey back to each other. As the evening wound down and guests began to say their goodbyes, Maya and Jake found themselves alone on the porch swing, where they'd had so many important conversations over the past year. Maya had changed out of her wedding dress into jeans and a soft sweater, but she still wore her veil, which Jake thought made her look like a fairy tale princess who'd decided to stay in the real world. "No regrets?" Jake asked, his arm around her shoulders as they swayed gently back and forth. "None," Maya replied without hesitation. "You? Only that it took us so long to get here." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of their guests drive away and listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. In the distance, they could hear cattle moving quietly in the pasture and the soft nickering of horses in the barn. "So what happens now?" Maya asked. "Now we live," Jake said simply. "We work the ranch, we take care of each other, we build the life we've been planning, and when problems come up, we face them together." "Together," Maya agreed, liking the sound of that word and everything it represented. 5 years later, on another perfect autumn day, Maya and Jake stood in the same spot where they'd been married, watching their 3-year-old daughter chase chickens around the yard while their infant son napped in Maya's arms. The ranch had prospered beyond their wildest dreams. Maya's veterinary practice served clients from 3 counties, and Jake's program for helping veterans had become a model that other communities were replicating. But the thing Maya treasured most was the quiet satisfaction of their daily life together. The way Jake still brought her coffee in bed every morning, the way they worked side by side in comfortable partnership, the way they'd learned to navigate disagreements with respect and honesty rather than fear and defensiveness. "Mama, look," their daughter called out, having successfully cornered a particularly patient hen. "I caught one." "Very good, sweetheart," Maya called back, then looked up at Jake with a smile. "She's going to be a rancher like her daddy, or a veterinarian like her mama," Jake replied, dropping a kiss on Maya's head. "Or something completely different that we haven't even thought of yet. As long as she's happy," Maya said, "and knows she's loved," Jake added. They stood together watching their children play in the same yard where they'd fallen in love as teenagers, where they'd said goodbye with broken hearts, where they'd found their way back to each other as adults who'd learned what real love actually meant. It wasn't the fairy tale romance they'd dreamed of when they were young. It was better. It was real, built on a foundation of trust and communication and mutual respect that had been tested and proven strong enough to last. Maya shifted the baby to her other arm and leaned into Jake's warmth, grateful for the long journey that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes the best love stories weren't about finding your soulmate at first sight.